So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Rebecca Wright. So Rebecca is the Duquesne Miller Professor of Computer Science and the Director of the Vagelos Computational Science Center at Barnard. She is currently on leave from Rutgers University, where she served as the Director of DMAX. Her research is focused on information security and in several areas of computer security. She works in privacy, applied cryptography, and the foundations of computer security. She's an editor of the International Journal of Information and Computer Security and the Transactions on Data Privacy. She's in the board of the Computer Research Association's Committee on the Status of Women in Computer Research, or CRAW. She received her PhD from Yale and a BA from Columbia University. And she's a fellow of the IEEE and a distinguished member of the ACM. And with that, yeah, again, we're very happy that she accepted our invitation. So thanks.
All right. See if that works. Great. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk today about accountability in computing. So you hear a lot of talk, not just in computing systems, but in general, about the need for accountability. People talk about how we need accountability so that we can prevent bad behavior or have consequences for that bad behavior. And it's not always completely clear what people mean when they're talking about that, but it's often about finding someone to blame, ensuring consequences for people who break the rules. And so what I'm going to talk about in this talk is accountability in the context of computing. I'll spend some time setting the context. I'm going to talk about accountability in a prevention to punishment spectrum and situating existing solutions on that. And then I'll talk about a possible avenue for defining accountability that is trace-driven and utility-based. That allows you both to talk about other systems but also to study accountability itself. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll end with some future directions. So in terms of accountability in computing, this is a conversation that's been going on for quite some time. Some quotes back from some articles in the 2008-2009. This hide it or lose it perspective on privacy, copyright, and surveillance is increasingly inadequate. As an alternative, accountability must become a primary means through which society addresses inappropriate use. Or appropriate use, and misplaced emphasis on prevention or security based on locks rather than accountability, security based on deterrence, has resulted in unusable security technology that people do not understand and often work around. And so, so even then, and in fact even earlier, this idea that the prevention-based security mechanisms that we typically focus on, while important, needed to be complemented by some understanding of farther down the spectrum that I'll talk about. And of course, more recently, accountability has been not just talked about, but in headlines in the news around things like Facebook and other kinds of social media, and how the openness of these kinds of platforms make them very susceptible to disinformation and other kinds of uses that we'd like to see more accountability, both for the actors that carry out those actions, but also for the platform itself and to have it built in. And similarly around things like cryptocurrency. That you need to make sure, and this is very much right. I mean, accounting has the same root as accountability, and certainly in traditional financial systems, accounting and understanding how money flows and where it goes and if it's appropriate is sort of built into the systems. So there's been more focus on making sure that as cryptocurrencies become actually used, that they have that same kind of accountability and transparency. So coming back onto the computing scenarios, some examples where a purely prevention-based approach seems inadequate are things like surveillance and copyright, where an agent might first need to break the policy. If the policy is you can only look at certain kinds of things or only use things in certain ways, you might first need to look at that content to figure out whether or not it's appropriate to be able to be looked at or not, such as in surveillance. Agents listening to the beginning of a phone call before figuring out whether it has relevance to a particular investigation and can continue to be listened to or not. Emergency type scenarios, things where you might want to say, in the case of a medical emergency, you might want to allow anyone in a hospital providing care to a patient to look at their medical records, even though they wouldn't normally be able to, and you don't want to slow down the emergency response by gaining new permissions, but you want to make sure afterwards that wasn't misused. As I alluded to, data exchange in our evolving online lives, in settings like search and e-commerce, online advertisements, back in the day, things like peer-to-peer music, still photo sharing, location-dependent services, and then again, kind of this social media. And all of these really share kind of two potential characteristics. One about some tension between openness and prevention, and the other having to do with high volume and wanting to have quick response. So similarly, things like micropayments or these robots.txt files that are there for web crawlers to look at, but don't have any kind of enforcement mechanism. So we've been looking at accountability for many years, and I should have said this is joint work with Joan Feigenbaum and Aaron Jaggard, as well as some pieces with others. And we've been looking at this since about 2011. In fact, in 2014, which I guess would have been the second hot sauce, we talked about some of our ideas towards these definitions and thinking about accountability. And Carl was probably there for that, maybe some others of you. And, and as I said, this is not really a new issue. Even sort of early days of email, as soon as email started to become widespread, and the advent of spam, and certainly in early peer-to-peer systems like Napster, where there's sort of this tragedy of the commons and ability for people to use resources in a way that is not very costly to them, but can be undesirable or costly on the other side. And one of the things that really piqued my interest in accountability as a topic was back in, I guess it was after September 11th, around 2001 and 2, you kept hearing people say, we need to know, some variation of, we need to know who everyone is all the time so that we can make sure bad things don't happen, right? And there was this assumption built in to a lot of the things you were hearing about security and the need for security, whether cybersecurity or anti-terrorism, that made this assumption that you needed to have strong identity. And I sort of wanted to say, well, that's not true, or maybe that's not true, but that without definitions, you can't really tell. You can't answer these questions, and so. So that led to my interest of thinking, what would a definition of accountability even really look like? And so there are various looser or more spelled out definitions of accountability or things somehow related to accountability, and they tend to focus on somewhat different concepts. Things like detecting that a violation occurred, what kind of evidence you might have of this, and how convincing it would be to third parties. Some notion of judgment or blame, meaning identifying an entity that violated a policy, or at least identifying a transaction or action that was a violation. Punishment, meaning consequences for that. Associating actions and identities, so this notion of identifiability, and then some kind of answerability, sort of the ability to make someone who did something wrong stand up for account, stand up for themselves. And so in most of those first five can really be thought of as in a temporal spectrum. Each one sort of supports the later On the left there we have typical prevention-based technologies. So the goal of the prevention-based technologies is that violations of policies don't even happen, although we all know that even with our prevention-based technologies, violations do often happen because the costs of having perfect security are usually untenable, things like actually not connecting to the network or having full functionality. So even in the context of prevention-based systems, these later parts of the spectrum actually come into play. And so the later parts, as I said, are things like being able to detect when a violation occurs and maybe localize it in some way, having evidence that could either be useful within the system for kind of investigating and understanding what's going on, or to present to some third party to make some kind of judgment, and then ultimately the potential for punishment. And one of the things about punishment, and this is true in our sort of real world society and the whole criminal justice systems, right? So punishment sort of serves two purposes. One is to have a direct consequence to those who break the rules and are caught. The other is that the existence of the potential of that punishment serves as a deterrence for others. So you hope that having a punishment mechanism isn't necessarily because you want to carry that out, but because it will prevent the violations from happening in the first place. And so in our study of accountability, then, we want to shift the focus later in this spectrum, and we are going to focus on punishment. And I won't keep saying punishment or deterrence, but just keep in mind we think about one of the goals of the punishment as being to provide deterrence in the broader context of the system. And then also we want to reduce any kind of identity assumptions built into the definitions, because if you say accountability means first you identify, then you punish, then you're not going to be able to answer my question of is that identity inherent. Whereas if you define it to just get to the punishment, then you can sort of look at are there implications that you need identification in order to do it, or are there ways to do it that don't require that. And also going a little bit more general than is sometimes done, we want to allow for mediated or automated punishment, and I'll say a little bit more about what that means later. But in particular, we don't want to require there to be some particular action taken to carry out a punishment if the system somehow carries it out without even detecting the violation. That for us would be of interest as well. So as I said, there have been other notions of accountability out there, both that explicitly mention it, and if you can also find notions that don't. And I should say, and I'm not going to mention it today, but there's in the sort of social science and criminal justice and lots of non-computing literature going way back. There's all kinds of notions of accountability and its importance, and although I'm not talking about it today, some of our work does draw on that, and we have some writing that kind of contextualizes both what's similar and what's a little bit different in the computing context, which is really just scale and need for real-time response in some cases. So, but looking at computing systems and computing literature, there are various notions of accountability that have been out there. So there are some that are more focused on the detection step, such as this one from Umer Effendi and Chase in 2007. A system is strongly accountable if it provides a means for each participant to determine for itself if others are behaving correctly without trusting assertions of misbehavior by another participant who may itself be compromised. So there's actually two important notions in here, at least. One is this detection, so determining if someone's misbehaving correctly, and the other is some kind of potential decentralization that each participant should be able to tell. And it could be satisfied by a decentralized mechanism where each participant does it on its own, or it could be somehow some kind of centralized system that tells everyone this information if you make assumptions that part can't be compromised. So there's some notion of decentralization versus trust built into that. And then there are some evidence-based definitions or notions as well. From 1996, accountability is the property whereby the association of a unique originator with an object or action can be proved to a third party. And one from 2007, an accountable system maintains a tamper-evident record that provides non-reputable evidence of all nodes' actions. So both of these are about
having something that can be shown to a third party or someone outside of the system to look at and be able to understand what's been going on. And then again, Umurfendi and Chase from 2005, one really focused on this association or identification of actions and principles. So an accountable system associates states and actions with identities and provides primitives for actors to validate the states and actions of their peers, such that cheating or misbehavior become detectable, provable, and undeniable by the perpetrator. And so again, here there's sort of an inherent notion of decentralization here and what individuals in a system can do. And then this idea that what gives you the accountability here is you can tell who the parties responsible for particular actions or outcomes are. And then in 2005, Lampson said this idea of punishment in there, or at least holding responsible. Accountability is the ability to hold an entity, such as a person or organization, responsible for its actions. And so I would say this is the closest to our definition, and we look to make it more precise, but put some real mathematical foundations in there so that you can actually start to look at a particular system and talk about what its accountability properties are, and also be able to study generally questions about accountability and what kind of trade-offs it might have. So our definition in a more intuitive form, and we do have more mathematical forms that I'll show you a little bit later, but not in complete detail today, is that an entity is accountable with respect to a policy P if whenever the entity violates P, then it is, or at least could be, punished in a targeted fashion. And there's a couple of important things here. So one is adding this with respect to policy P, right? You can't really say a system is accountable or not accountable. You have to understand it's accountable with respect to what kinds of policies that you'd like to satisfy, what kind of properties you'd like the system to have. And we do allow some kind of intentional refraining from punishment. So, and this comes a little bit to the notion of deterrence, where even just the possibility that this punishment could happen should be enough, but also that we don't want to require that the systems always actually implement that punishment in order to say that they're accountable. We do, though, require that this punishment could be possible, not just blame. It's not enough to just identify it for our purposes and our definition, our feeling of what constitutes accountability. It's not enough to just say, oh, that's the guy that did this thing, but we have no way to punish him even if we wanted to. We want to be able to, there should be some mechanism that punishment could take place. But similarly, or conversely, we don't require blame as long as punishment occurs. So if the system somehow enforces some negative consequence to someone when she violates a policy, then for us that does count as punishment. And I should note, so I've worked on privacy a lot as well, including definitions, and this has very much the same thing. So this is one way to view accountability. It's one that we feel makes a lot of sense. If when you talk about accountability, what you mean is something different, and this does not satisfy it, then this isn't really a useful definition for you. And so some of the potential usefulness of definitions like this is to help sort out different behaviors and different systems and clarify, but it is important to have sort of a, if society cares about accountability, it is important for that same society to decide whether this is capturing what they care about when they talk about accountability. And I mentioned that especially in the context of this automatic punishment, right? So our thinking is that accountability is about ensuring that bad actors have consequences or the potential of consequences. If what you really care about when you think about accountability is, this person can be identified and put up there on the stage so that we can all, throw tomatoes, and know who that person is. If that's what you mean by accountability, then some parts of our definition to you wouldn't really look like accountability. So that's just something sort of outside of the technology part, but worth thinking about. So, so let me, to sort of get at some of these concepts, let me talk about a toy example, and this is a real-world example, although you would not actually implement it this way, of a car dealership lot. So the policy in this case is that people shouldn't be able to drive cars off the lot without paying for them first. Let's imagine this is a car dealership in a place with lots of real estate in it, so it's got a test drive area right there on the lot. And so you could have different ways of addressing this policy. So on the one hand, you could have mediated identifiable accountability, which would say, could be achieved, for example, by saying a customer should show ID and sign some paperwork if they want to drive the car around the lot. And if while doing that, they leave the lot in that car without payment, then a judge can punish her based on that presented evidence. You could have a prevention-based approach where you'd have some exit with an electronic shutoff device, and any of the lots owned by the cars owned by the car dealership would be shut off as they tried to cross that threshold, and so they wouldn't make it out. And this electronic shutoff can only be disabled by the manager, who would do it upon payment and let a particular car through. And then you could have what we would call automatic accountability, and it would be anonymous in that you don't need to know who's driving. So anyone could come in and get in cars and drive them around the lot, but if they tried to drive off the lot, the car would blow up with its passengers in it. As I said, not how you would actually want to implement this. And this would be disabled only by the manager, who could do so upon payment. So, you know, again, this is a toy example, but it sort of illustrates the difference between automatic and mediated punishment, the difference between identifiable and not, and sort of that spectrum of prevention before the fact, enforcement versus actions that take place afterwards. So, so even before we go into a more detailed notion of this accountability, just this spectrum of prevention through detection and evidence and judgment and punishment can be applied to a lot of existing computing systems that aim to provide some notion of accountability. And so I do not expect you to read this, certainly now and maybe ever, but if you do want to read it in detail, we have a manuscript that goes in detail here and explains it all. But what we are doing here is looking in this table at a bunch of different approaches or papers that talk about some kind of distributed computing type system that is they either explicitly say that it provides accountability or is focused on not just prevention, but kind of detection and evidence and judgment and punishment. And going across the right in these different columns, then we have columns for prevention, detection, evidence, judgment or blame, and punishment. And we look at the extent to which these different systems satisfy it. And since we were focused on ones that were about accountability, you don't see a lot of checkboxes in the prevention column because we're focusing on systems that have mechanisms beyond prevention. And then you see a lot of checkboxes under detection, and then some of them go beyond detection to actually having evidence, and that's really the goals of those systems or methods, is to create evidence that can be shown to third parties outside of the systems. Most of them don't then say what actually happens. They assume there's some external kind of action that will be taken on, by that third party, possibly relying on things like the court system that are robust and exist. But some, especially as you move down to the bottom of the chart where we're looking at judgment or blame, have mechanisms in the system itself for providing some kind of judgment or blame, identifying the actions that caused the violation and or the principals who caused those actions, and then in some cases at the very bottom having some kind of punishment that then happens within the system or in some cases outside of the system, all of which, in the ones that we looked at, require some kind of mediation to happen. And you can also look in that similar spectrum of other aspects of the systems about information, so things like this question of identification and is the identity provided within the system or externally, and are the violations identified, are those violators identified, as well as what kinds of actions are needed. Are they centralized actions? Is the punishing entity, or decentralized, or is the punishing entity internal or external? And does the punishment to take effect, does it require the violator to continue participating? For example, there are some peer-to-peer type systems where participants are supposed to contribute resources in order to be able to take out resources, and the punishment for someone who takes out more resources than they put in is they stop getting resources, and you can only affect that punishment if they actually stay in the system. So I'll spend even less time on this, but you can see you can apply these same kind of categorizations to this same set of systems, looking across then these questions of information and action. So I'm just going to grab some. So there's a bunch of different approaches taken to get this kind of evidence or ability to carry out punishment. So, and I'll just talk about some exemplifiers of those approaches. So one approach is capture everything. So systems like peer review collect evidence that allows participants to prove violations are committed and identify participations who omit required actions. And they do this by having log messages with a tamper-evident log, using cryptographic mechanisms or potentially hardware mechanisms, and authenticators to prove sending and receipt of every single message, and also that those messages were logged. The evidence can then be replayed to verify correctness, so it's got a lot of completeness and accuracy. There's many extensions, and there's other approaches, and so it's really just, this is the we have to know who everyone is at all times approach, so that later, whenever misbehavior is done, you can say, well, how did we get here, and look who's responsible. Another approach is lightweight localization. This is exemplified by a system called Audit that is in the context of internet routing and is looking to learn about and localize loss of messages or delay in internet routing. And the idea here is to use unauthenticated feedback, so you don't have the high overhead of lots of cryptographic mechanisms. And so different parties in the system, senders and receivers of messages, are supposed to give updates about, say, the status of a given link. Are messages moving fast or slow on a given link, for example? And if at any point someone sees inconsistent feedback in the system where one party is reporting a link is working fine and another party is reporting that it doesn't, for example, that would lead to some kind of further investigation, but it's not specified. That could then be external to the system or more close watching in the future of that link or something else. But it has the nice property that if at all times some domain or subnet, some entity A in the system is providing correct feedback about its own operation, then no peer can blame A in a way that would be convincing, because it would lead to inconsistent feedback and require, well, it could be convincing depending on the setup, but it will create the need for further investigation because it will lead to inconsistent feedback, which would require this step of further investigation. So it has a lightweight mechanism that gives at least some protection against false accusations. There are other broad approaches, auditing mechanisms, which tend to include this sort of logging, but also this idea that you can look in more detail in some cases at some parts of the system, cryptographic commitments, so that there is some record of what happened or what was going to happen, and then things for punishment, things like banishment from a system are a way to, if you assume that the reward of participating in a system is important, then kicking someone out if they misbehave is there. Diminished anonymity can work as a punishment, that you have generally an operation mode where people are not identified and entities are not identified, but if they misbehave, then they become identifiable. Or diminished reputation. So reputation-based systems can very much be looked at in this context, and good operation gives you enhanced reputation, bad operation gives you the punishment of a diminished reputation. So the kinds of things we have been doing in our research agenda in this is looking to formalize accountability and related concepts that can help clarify various interrelated and often conflated notions and provide a framework for formal analysis, and then to be able to use these ideas, these kinds of formal definitions, to study accountability. And as I said, my own interest is especially in understanding the identity requirements in systems. So being able to prove trade-offs or impossibility results, and be able to give a more robust answer to the question of whether identity is required or not in a general case, not just the way a particular system may be designed. And so, in terms of explicating relationships among accountability and related properties, some of these I've mentioned already, things like punishment, and is that sufficient for accountability, or to what extent is it achieving accountability? Detection, is that necessary? The need for identification or authorization, compensation, potentially for victims, maybe in some cases, is more important than the punishment of the actors that carried out the violation. And then this question about when you actually start looking in a system of how you would provide accountability and whether you need identifiability or not, it seems to relate to a notion of somehow whether a system is closed or open, whether there's a clear boundary, things like that exit in the car dealership lot that can be a point for a mechanism to take effect or not. And so then again, as I said, an example of a research question then might be that starts to look a little more specific, that you might be able to answer it, is in open systems with mediated punishment, are anonymity and accountability compatible? And so to get to even closer along the way to being able to address questions like this, you need to move more towards a formal definition. I'm not going to give you our whole definition, but I'll give you sort of a hint of it. So it's a trace-based definition where we capture the system as a finite sequence of events. You might, in some cases, want to generalize this to infinite sequences. In our case, we think of finite, and so an outcome is just an end state where there is no further extensions. If you want to capture things like ongoing behavior of a system, say Facebook, you would want to have various states designated as outcome states, so you could look at the outcome states to figure out whether violations had occurred and who might have caused them, but we focused on finite for now. We assume there's some kind of violation predicate, so given any trace, you can ask if the trace violates the policy in question or not. And an event E is a violation if at trace T, if the violation predicate holds on TE but not T, so that event itself is the one that leads to a trace that has a violation. And then we also incorporate utilities so that we can talk about punishment. And so we assume each principle has a utility function defined on outcomes of the system, so it's not necessarily defined at every state of the system, but any state that's considered an outcome has some kind of utility. And this is how we determine whether something is considered a punishment or not. And you can do this either for some notion of expected utility or the most typical utility or something else. And so those concepts are enough then that we can capture both automated and mediated punishment. So automated punishment would look something like this, where you have some trace going on, and then either a violation occurs or not. And in a system that provides automated punishment for that kind of violation is one where that violation event always leads to a state that could have a punishing event. And so the outcomes for that party are always worse than the ones where that violation does not occur. In mediated punishment, it's a little more complicated. because you want to impact the punishment, but it's going to happen by a different action. And so in that case, it looks something at the beginning very much the same. You have some trace going on, you have a violation, and then you consider what would have happened without that violation. And as long as there's some punishing event that happens later that ensures that the violation event leads to or could lead to the punishment, then we say that satisfies the mediating punishment. And so another important notion in here is causality. So we require that the punishing event must be caused by the fact of the violation. We don't actually define ourselves a notion of causality. That's a tricky thing to do, but there are some existing definitions out there, and you can use different notions and you'll get different, somewhat different results. So depending on the notion of causality, though, this kind of mediated punishment can capture automated punishment if the violation itself serves as that punishing event. In all cases, then that would back out to automated punishment. So we also need to get at concepts of who are the actors in the system and what are the actions. And so in a simple version, that looks something like this. And in particular, since we want to be able to allow for the case that participation might be anonymous, but also that it might not, we separate the principals, who we think of as the people or entities that have identity associated with them, and then NIMs, where NIMs are identities within a system, and there's some kind of mapping of principals to NIMs, but it could be that a single principal may operate under one or more than one NIM, and similarly it could be that multiple principals operate under the same NIM, so that's a many-to-many mapping potentially. And NIMs take actions within the system, and we draw this system boundary here, which could be a strong boundary or a looser boundary. And of course, systems can be built up of multiple systems, so you can apply this at many levels. To actually instantiate this with all the kinds of actions and blaming actions and violations and punishment, it gets a bit more complicated, where for each of the kinds of entities, the principals and the NIMs, we separate blaming actions and punishment actions. We have various kinds of relationships like identification between NIMs and principals, and actions or evidence between actions and NIMs, and violations and detection. In the simplest case, you can just think about the principals take actions using NIMs in a system. And so this can be defined more formally. Informally, the NIMs are these identities that principal use to interact within a system, and a violation predicate holds on actions, right? So that, again, a violation, an action is a violation if before the trace, the system satisfied the predicate, and afterwards it did not. And a blameworthiness predicate, which has to do with saying that principle is associated with the action that was a violation. So in a good accountability system, you only punish the blameworthy. You don't have punishment for the non-blameworthy. So another example then, with a little bit more of the notation built in, consider the case of software vulnerabilities. So suppose Alice, acting as NIM N, finds a software vulnerability, and consider two traces, a trace TP, following a policy, say, where she discloses it responsibly, so she tells the software provider, there's this vulnerability, you should fix it, and a different trace, TE, in which she chooses to exploit that vulnerability for her own gain, or sells it on the black market, something like that. So if Alice can obtain sufficient payment for exploiting the vulnerability, she may choose that, and her ability to do that without repercussion likely would depend on the extent to which she could be identified. And so as extremes, the difference between a case where she could definitely not be identified and one where she potentially could would be shown by mappings between principals and NIMs, where on one case, if all the principals in the world are mapped to a NIM that is their own identity, and so anytime a principal acts, you can tell, anytime a NIM acts, you can tell which principal it was, versus an anonymous version where all principals are mapped to the same NIM, so everything looks the same from the perspective of whatever system we're looking at here. And so that's how the anonymity versus identity plays out. And of course, if Alice can be identified, she may care about her increased or decreased reputation for her action. So not only the payment in dollars she might get for exploiting the vulnerability, or any payment she might get from the software provider for disclosing to them, but also if she can be identified broadly in the world, being identified as someone who can find these bugs might be valuable to her, or anything else. So, which is to say that her utility may depend on being identified. And so, as I alluded to before, punishment we assume is provided in a way that is intended to reduce utility of someone. So we define it in a utility theoretic way. The utility should depend on the trace. So we want some utility that captures different outcomes in the systems. It should depend on this connection between principals and NIMs, so different principals and different NIMs may have different utilities. And these two parts, the part that depends on the trace and the part that depends on the identification, we want to be separable, again, partly because we're interested in studying this question about the impact of identity as represented by the connection between principals and NIMs. So I'm not going to talk a lot about utilities, except to say that we put some work into, so you might like to say for any utility function certain things hold, but in order to actually sort of prove things about the ability to carry out punishment or the usefulness of an accountability mechanism, you need to make some kind of assumption about being able to, that there are some kinds of events that can function as punishment, and in particular, we want something expressive enough, right? So we want something that restricts utilities in some way so we can prove things, but we do want things that are expressive enough to capture the kinds of things we might care about. In particular, we do want to be able to capture reputation-based approaches to punishment, since that seems to be an important mechanism for providing accountability. And so what we've been using as a way to get some specificity while still keeping enough expressiveness is this kind of utilities with linear transfer, and so these are like quasi-linear utilities, if you're familiar with those. The linear transfer is allowing transfer of utility among at least different principles, different NIMs used by a given principal. So if I get benefit associated, if I have many identities in a system and I get benefits associated with one and punishments associated with the other, this gives me a way to consider them as a pool. And so with that, I'm going to turn to the last topic that I'll talk about in a little detail before kind of wrapping things up, which is coming back now to this question of accountability and identifiability, because I think it's really interesting and important to understand the extent to which these can and cannot be separated. And so again, the question there is it possible to have accountability without identifiability? And so, I guess my hope was still that when I heard someone say, we have to have identity all the time because we need accountability, I could say, well, yes, you're right, or no, actually, you don't have to. And of course, it turns out the answer seems to be, it depends. But now I can have a more nuanced discussion about what it depends on and why. So again, since I think these examples, even though they're real world sort of smaller scale examples that don't sort of bring up all the nuances that happen in today's kinds of computing environments, I still think they're useful for talking about the concepts. We'll come back to another simple example here. So a state fair. So imagine you've got this big this big place here that's a state fair. Anyone can buy a ticket to come in. They don't need to show identification to do so. But the fair wants to know who has and hasn't paid, at least to the extent that those who are not paid don't get to come in. But it doesn't necessarily need to know identities beyond this, so that could be satisfied by just having a single entrance way that people can come in with some kind of ticket or exactly as they pay. But they might have additional refinements of identity, so they might also issue, say, wristbands for those who've shown that they are old enough to purchase alcohol or have purchased some ability to go to the front of lines or something like that. And if someone violates fair rules, the fair authorities might attempt to either identify them and then do something else or ask them to leave. And so that's a sort of familiar model. Similarly, in an auction house, you can have examples of multiple NIMs or not. So you might have bidding paddles for bidders so that you've got unique, no two bidders have the same paddle number. And so bidders bid by holding up their paddles. Those paddles serve as unique identifiers within the auction house. And the auctioneer and the other bidders don't need to know the real identities, but in order for the auction house itself to know that it's going to be paid for the items that it selects a winning bidder for, it might, in order to buy the paddles or get the paddles, it might require either real identities or some sufficient cash deposit so that it doesn't happen that at the end of the auction, the bidders just walk away and the winning bidders say, oh, I didn't really want that. And then I want to come back also to automated punishment, because automated punishment can actually serve as a way to provide our notion of accountability without identifiability, and specifically it does this through what are called incentive-compatible protocols. So an incentive-compatible protocol is one that's designed so that some behavior of the some policy is enforced by having the property that if participants behave according to their true valuation. So, for instance, in that bidding case, an auction protocol is incentive compatible if it is better for participants in the system, or at least as good for participants in the system, to say how much they actually are willing to pay for an item than to try to game the system by trying to bid something less. And the nice thing about incentive-compatible protocols, by definition, is they say that behaving according to your true valuations gives you better results. And so in particular, that means if you have a policy that says behave according to your true valuations, like bid your real value, then violating that policy produces a state where the participants are less well off. And so that actually doesn't require mediation for punishment. And if the protocol itself doesn't require identification, like in that bidding case, if you use the cash deposit rather than identifying, then that system itself can be seen as a mechanism for providing accountability with respect to that policy or providing punishment without identification. So that already answers the question, is it possible to have punishment without identification? And if you sort of take our view that or if you're in a setting where that punishment itself is sufficient to provide accountability, then this answers a question that says there are cases where you do not need identities in order to have that kind of accountability. Now, again, you may say, well, that's not really what I meant by accountability, so for you it may not answer that question. But also, it's not always possible, or it may be have other kinds of undesirable properties in a solution to be incentive compatible, or to have this kind of automatic punishment. So mediated punishment is sometimes going to be needed or desirable. But at least in the case of automated punishment, this says it can be possible to have accountability by our notion without identifiability. So moving to the question of in mediated systems, It seems that this has a lot to do with whether a system is open or closed, and this is another fuzzy concept, but one that we're sort of familiar with. So in an open system, users can come and go. They might be able to be anonymous. There may still be some requirements of participation, but there's sort of this sense that even the system itself doesn't really have a strong sense of who the underlying principles are in the system. In closed systems, the users are more tightly regulated as a condition of participating. They might need to establish some kind of identity, connecting it to other verified means of identities like driver's licenses or some other credential in order to join, and their identities might be revealed to other system participants routinely as part of the behavior of the system. And of course, many systems are somewhere in between. So for example, if you come to back to that state fair example, if you look at the way we set it up, then it's an open system in that anyone can come and go. There's only one NIM if you do it in the most anonymous way, which is participant or not. So this, you get let in at the boundary. But we are assuming that there is this loose way to control with the ticket, so it's got some bit of close to it. The wristbands gives you 2 NIMs only if you just go with the wristband approach, 1 wristband, 1 no wristband. But we do have this idea that there's these authorities who can possibly identify or punish these people. And so, not complete definitions, but you can start to define some of the important parts about what makes these systems closed or open, and just looking at the top and the bottom one here. So in particular, for a closed system, you might go all the way to saying for that's fully closed for principal to participate using some NIM N in the system. The system must have the ability to determine the set of principles that act as that NIM. So you might still have a many-to-one mapping for that NIM, but the system needs to know who those principles are. And in a strongly open system, you might say then for every NIM, the system is unable to reliably determine what that set of principles are. And that, plus more definitions that I'm not going to show you, but are sort of what you might expect them to be, we can actually get to an answerable version of this research question, which becomes more specific. In open systems with mediated punishment, are accountability and anonymity compatible? And so the theorem looks like this. If an open system is always able to punish a blameworthy principle in a targeted and mediated way, so that's just saying it doesn't just have punishments, it somehow punishes the right principles, and it does it not by punishing everyone, but by punishing just that principle or some smaller set perhaps, then for any violation that occurs in the system must have realizable principal attribution for that event, so meaning that it can tell who the principles associated with that violation was, or it must be able to carry out punishments in some other way, must be able to decrease the utility of the NIM used to take that action, and it has to be able to do it, if it wasn't able to identify, it has to do it in such a way that the decrease in that principle's utility from that NIM must be larger than the magnitude of all the possible increases it gets from other NIMs. And so, interpreting that a little bit, then it's saying that if the system is open, so that it's not able to determine the principles acting as a NIM, the punishment is targeted and mediated, and the violation cannot be linked to that set of principles related to the violator, then the punishment must be meted out through that NIM used for the violation, and it must be sufficiently large to offset any other positive effects on other NIMs. And so this is actually saying that having limited identity in a system does constrain how punishment can be affected. And so so that's part of the answer is sort of, so it is true that it's easier, or at least not harder, to carry out accountability through punishment by having identities. And in particular, it's easier because you can just stop at the identification piece and then assume there's some other mechanism. But even if you want to carry it all out within the system, if you don't know who, in a strong way, who the principles carrying out actions are, you have to be much stronger in your ability to punish and broader. So to conclude, then, I think, and I'm stepping sort of way out here, I think it's important to remember in a security symposium where we focus on all the things that can go wrong, that the reason we're in this scenario in the first place is because today's technology is so valuable, right? So it creates huge opportunities, in this case, I'm especially focusing on things for convenience or connection, but other kinds of benefits to society. But with that comes the potential for security breaches, privacy invasion, weaponization of information, and all these things that we've seen and seem to be on the rise. We think accountability is an important goal to think about along with other kinds of security goals, especially complementing the prevention-based approaches. And this is true both for individuals, but also for the providers of technology applications and technology infrastructure. Preventive approaches certainly are important and relevant. The accountability approach can complement those, but also make use of them so that they sit in a larger context. And the insights gained in this kind of work, this kind of focus on the foundations and understanding what the properties you might want are and understanding when they are and are not satisfied, ultimately can lead to better system design, more informed choices by decision makers and users of these systems. So in terms of future directions, we're interested, we're still sort of refining and applying our model, including using it to guide system design. I think some of these ideas might be useful in thinking about this question of how to combat disinformation in social media. And we're continuing our investigation of these conceptual relationships and mathematical relationships among things like accountability, deterrence, identification, et cetera. So with that, I will conclude, and I'm happy to take questions if I have time.